Life is a workout, and Smoothie King is here to help you power through. Whether you're grinding out bicep curls or muscling the couch across the living room, crushing morning miles, or sprinting through back-to-back meetings, Smoothie King has fuel to help you maximize your workouts, own your recovery, and elevate your game. Give your body the energy, protein, and power it needs with a lineup of delicious smoothies made to help you conquer your goals. Only at Smoothie King.
Now it's time for Inspirational Women and my guest, Megan Asaka, an historian, author, and assistant professor of history at the University of California, Riverside. Megan is the author of a new book, Seattle from the Margins, and is here to provide some insights and also to invite us to a book event on the weekend. Megan Asaka, good morning. Thank you so greatly for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, really, this is my good fortune, my pleasure that we're able to have this conversation about this new book, Seattle from the Margins, Exclusion, Erasure, and the Making of a Pacific Coast City. It's an amazing piece of writing and really is so insightful and so critically important, well, just overall, but now it seems to just really be the time for it to be here and for us to be learning some of this history.
Well, I'm so glad that you are saying that. I did feel like, yes, it's a history from, the very early origins of Seattle, and I stop at, right at World War II, but I do think it continues to have relevance into the present. And that's kind of what I was imagining when I wrote the book, that it's about an early period in Seattle history, but that period is so crucial to understanding so many of the present day issues that we still see in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest.
Exactly. And, there were bits and pieces that I felt somewhat aware of, which is World War II with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and then the displacement, the internment camps for the Japanese citizens and residents, but many were citizens and were displaced. So we kind of know this, but there's so much more that really led up to that and is all enmeshed in that.
Yes. I mean, I end the book actually kind of around 1940, 1941. So I don't get into the war years very much at all, but it definitely, I hope, sheds light on Japanese American history in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, and helps to explain, I think, how it is possible that this whole population of people, it was over 10,000 in Seattle by 1940, could be removed, from the city in that way, because the incarceration is often told as a national story, and yet the local context is so important. So I wanted to highlight that Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans by 1941, by Pearl Harbor, had played a really important role at one time in the economy, and that role had kind of diminished. They no longer had an important place in the economy of Seattle and the larger region. And so that's one of the reasons why I think they were removed and why they kind of, were displaced, is because they were seen as expendable by the city. And so Pearl Harbor and, Executive Order 9066 in 1942 was kind of this, obviously, it was like a flashpoint, I think, in a larger and longer transformation of Japanese Americans over time. But certainly by 1941, they didn't have the economic power that they once did, and so weren't as important to the city anymore.
Although I think we could argue with the work that was still being done, and maybe it was even the valuable farmland that they possessed and that they worked on that was the reason for their being expendable, basically.
Yes, for sure. And I think that, there were laws in place at state and federal level that had really tried to prevent Japanese people in the U.S. from becoming citizens, for example, from owning property. And so, or to make it very difficult for them to own property. Some of them were managed to, but there were many laws in place starting in, the early 20th century that were really aimed at trying to prevent them from becoming permanent members of society and from becoming, part of the United States. And so that's part of the story too, for sure. And also the economic motivations that people had in the city who could take over then some of the, businesses that they did run and take over those. So that was also a kind of motivation, I think, too, among people, kind of local residents who were seeing it as an opportunity to maybe take over a business for very little money, to buy up farm equipment, that was being sold in the frantic days, I think, right before the mass removals really happened. So there was that too as well. You're definitely right about that. Yeah.
So we have to face what was going on, and you help us to do that because while we kind of know it, I think it's just kind of in the back of our minds. But really, right now we still see this whole struggle that we have. It's more than a struggle, but that goes on regarding migrant workers and how we treat people that are doing a service we really need and want, and yet the way that we treat human beings.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge part of the story that I wanted to highlight is how this is also a story of people who are, needed to do the work to make the economy, possible, to actually literally build the city, physically build the city, to be the agricultural workforce, to be the lumber workforce. And yet all the barriers that were put in place to prevent them from becoming part of the city. And they were constantly being told and treated as if they were troublemakers, as if they were undesirable, and they were segregated in many ways. And there were efforts to keep them away from, the permanent sort of white residents who lived in different areas of the city. So that is really also a story of that we see still today. I mean, in a kind of a different form and with different groups, but how, this economy of our country and capitalism really requires, workers, and yet those workers are constantly being told that they are undesirable and they are, segregated, and they're told that they're not welcome to become part of the country. That is definitely still, we see that, of course, today.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I'm glad you picked up on that, because that was definitely a theme that I wanted to highlight with the book as well. This theme of labor and of capitalism, and how workers who have really done the hard work of building the city aren't often seen as being worthy of being included into urban society. And they're also written out of the historical memory of the city in terms of who we think about, right? When we think about the important figures in early Seattle history, it's not the migrant workers, right? The ones who actually contributed to building the city. It's the kind of the typical sort of pioneers, quote unquote pioneers, and other important figures. And yet the ones who were important in doing the work often get written out of that.
Exactly. Because if they were not here to do the lumber work, to build the railroads, to do the gardening, to plant and to reap, how would those who are the big names really have been able to accomplish anything?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, that's the thing. And yet we don't. I feel like, especially in Seattle history, that aspect of it is never highlighted as much. So I felt like that was a missing piece of the story. And because Seattle's workforce was so migratory, I think that contributed to, a kind of forgetting of them later on by historians. And there was also an effort by the city in the 30s and 40s, which I talk about in the later chapters of the book, to actually just displace them and to kind of do these, they were called slum clearance projects. So the city would come and declare a certain area a slum and then bulldoze it and just displace the residents. So that happened a lot too. So there was a kind of deliberate, I think, attempt to displace the workers and just to kind of physically erase them from the city as well. So that was also part of it. But I think it's, the book was really trying to call attention to not only this like history of these workers and this workforce and the important role that they played in building the city, but also why we don't remember them as much and why they aren't a group that we tend to remember, that we tend to value in our collective, memory of the city and how we think about Seattle history. And I'm saying we here because I am from Seattle too.
Right.
So I'm talking also as a Seattle resident and someone who grew up in Seattle, and I worked as a public historian in Seattle for many years. So I also understand the kinds of stories that Seattle tells about itself. And the book in a way was an effort to kind of provide an alternative story.
Right. Because you grew up seeing that kind of disconnection between what was being told and what was in the history books and what you knew was your experience and your family's experience.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the original motivation of the book, was to, I was always interested in history. I think like both my Japanese American side, and I was always interested in that story, as well as on my mom's side. She's a white woman from Iowa, but her mom and grandmother, so my grandmother and great grandmother, were also really interested in family history too. So I kind of got it on both sides. And for me, though, as I got older, I was really interested in history. I was interested in my family history, but then I would never quite see, my Japanese American family story, like what they went through, reflected in, not even in the historical scholarship, but just in the kind of public narratives at museums and news articles and, these kinds of sites that you go to where, you learn about history, these public history sites. I felt that there was something missing in terms of the place of Japanese Americans and their removal from the city. And then this idea that Seattle was somehow a progressive city that wasn't as bad as other cities when it came to race, and that, Seattle kind of existed outside of this fraught racial history of other cities, and that we were a progressive, open-minded city. And that never sat well with me. And so when I was young, I was just always kind of wondering why that was. And I obviously noticed that I felt like that wasn't true necessarily, but I was curious in that disconnect. And so that's what motivated my interest in telling a different kind of Seattle history. But I think the topic of the book, which is it's about that, but it also tells the story of a particular workforce and groups of people who have been written out. That specific focus came a bit later on in the research process. But yeah, I think the motivations for me was definitely to write a different kind of history of Seattle, write a history of the city that I think reflects more of, people who aren't often talked about in Seattle history, and to kind of really subvert the idea that Seattle is a kind of progressive and open-minded city, and to really ask, not only is that true, because it's, every city in the U.S. has a very fraught racial history, but kind of like, why is it that we still believe that? And what is that obscuring, right? When we sort of hold on to that idea, what kinds of histories is that obscuring? What kinds of, tensions and things that aren't so great about Seattle history? I feel like that really obscures those moments too. So it's really important to I think that's where history in particular is important. Sometimes it's not difficult, or sometimes it's difficult to hear, and there's definitely like moments of, violence in the book that I talk about, but it's important that we know about these things too, in order to fully understand the complexity of Seattle history.
Yes, definitely. Because if we don't acknowledge and see the truth of what has gone on, yet if we're calling this a progressive city and we desire that, then unless we're really honest, we can't get to really authentically being that.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's right. That's exactly right. And that's kind of what the book talks about, and also how I feel myself as a historian. I think that history is not just about the past, but it's also about the present. And, it's this kind of like, it's this relationship between past and present. And we're just really, how can we function as a city if we're not fully aware of our past? And we can't actually face some of the things that are in our past, which aren't so great, right? And so I think that it's really crucial to have a critical history and to have a critical eye on the past in order to kind of understand how we got here in the first place, and then how we go, what we do from here. And that's kind of, I teach history at the college level, and that's like the message I give my students, really, is that yes, you're learning about the past, but we're also, learning about how the past shapes the present. And so in that way, I think history can be very empowering for students. I think a lot of students come into history thinking it's about memorization and about like presidents, learning presidents' names and, that kind of thing. But I think, history can actually be very empowering as well. And so I try to teach history that way. Like, this is going to help you make sense of the world. This is going to equip you with certain, with ideas and skills to be able to understand the present and to be able to like shape the future. That's the other thing about history. History is very future oriented as well. I think it can be. It's not always, but it can be. So I'm really trying to, I think, shift how my students, and also, as I write in the book, how we tend to think about history is something that's kind of like dead in the past. History is definitely not dead and in the past. It's present. It's in, Seattle, and the way that Seattle is structured, north-south, the kind of racial segregation that I talk about in the book. I mean, it's still here. It's still in the city. It's still the way that, the city is divided. And, that's a concrete example, I think, of how, going back to that early period in history, we can see how much it's still connected to the present.
Exactly. And it's important to learn this, because if we only start from today, such as myself, having moved to the city, well, it's been several decades now, but thinking of it in those terms of it being this kind of beacon city, of a progressive city, but then, digging down and seeing some of the not so pretty parts of it, it's important to know, so we can't undo that, but we can certainly learn and improve so that we do what we can to change those barriers.
Yeah, and I think it's also helpful to kind of like learn like lessons from the past, like what didn't work, and to not repeat those. That's very, like, even just from like a policy perspective, from like the city, itself, the city of Seattle, from a policy perspective. You can actually go back, there's case studies in my book where I talk about urban planning, and I talk about the fire department, and I talk about, the housing authority. And I actually talk about some of the, moments when they really, I think, made mistakes, when they were, targeting the wrong people, when they were, operating out of fear, and they were targeting certain people, right? And so I think that there's also, hopefully, some actually concrete things in the book that can help people learn just from a policy level about, this is not what to do, because some of this, the city of Seattle, like municipal government, doesn't come off looking very good in the book. And that's an important lesson, I think, for, city officials too, is to like be able to look back and say, oh, well, we had these good intentions to build Yesler Terrace, which is the last chapter of my book, the public housing project. And I talk about how Yesler Terrace, there was no racial segregation sort of named in, the housing authority that operated it never said like, this is a segregated space. And yet they imposed policies that made it segregated in practice. So, they only let people live there who were legally married, who were U.S. citizens, and they handpicked people according to, if they adhered to certain, they had to be good housekeepers, and they had to have, there were certain standards that people had to uphold that resulted in a population of Yesler Terrace that was almost exclusively white. And so that's a moment where you can actually look back and say, this is how, this racial segregation at Yesler Terrace kind of was envisioned in 1939, 1940. Like, let's not do that again. Like, let's actually look at this concrete example, and we can actually change how we approach these things today. So I actually think it's also not just about history in general, but it's, I think, important just even from a policy level, just specific policies and practices that really did reinforce, racism and racial segregation that were coming from the city that actually I think it's a good case study, again, as I said, of what not to do and kind of how the city can function in a way that works better for everyone.
So taking that in hand and thinking about changes occurring, do we have or is there a way that you or people who are more informed along this line really talk with the city and with these different entities within the city, like the Housing Authority, to look at what has been done and to become conscious of making it different and better?
Well, I personally have not been in conversation with the city, but I do know that this city did. I gave a talk at the University of Washington a couple of weeks ago, and folks from the city did come and film the talk, and they have it on the Seattle channel, and they have it on their website. And I do hope that, it's read by people in the city. This is one of the things I think is important, actually, is that city agencies become more aware of history and the history within their own kind of divisions, because I think that could really help. I'm not currently aware of any kind of partnerships or, anything that's happening along those lines concretely. And partly it's also because I don't live in Seattle anymore. I live in California, much to my parents' dismay. But so that's partly I'm not as connected with Seattle. But I do think you bring up an important point, which is city agencies, not just Seattle, just everywhere. I see this in LA where I live too. It's so important that people who are leading these agencies are aware of the history of their own workplaces and of their particular, urban planning division and housing authority divisions, because that's one way I think that we can actually start changing things. But I have to say, I haven't personally been involved in those conversations.
And I would wager to say that this kind of thinking, openness, and having a true progressive mentality is not just, as you say, an LA situation or Seattle. I think it's all of North America, Canada and the U.S., where there's just been this kind of history that we push back and we're just thinking about the present and the progress we've made.
Yeah, that's so true. And I actually think something I wanted to do in the book was to say, actually, I think Seattle is not all that different from other cities, right? To kind of say, in fact, this is yes, Seattle has its own particular history and its own dynamics. And yet I actually think that it can also be a case study that's applicable to other cities as well. Because I think you're right. This is not just about Seattle. This goes beyond the city. This is North America. It extends to, other regions as well. And I think that that's a really important point to make, and something that I hope people will take from the book. And I think it's, first, I directed at Seattle audiences because it is a very Seattle-specific book, and yet I think there's lessons there, to other people who live in other cities like Seattle or, San Francisco, Portland, even places like New York, obviously, that have much different histories. And yet I think there's something that Seattle can offer. Maybe people will learn something new or a new way of thinking about their own city, even if it's not Seattle.
Precisely, yes. Just like with any kind of literature we read, there are lessons that come forward. Here, it's factual, it's history that's gone on, and yes, it's kind of been different in different areas, but still there are lessons to be learned. And rather than think we're better than someone else or greater than someone, just
right.
We're all a work in progress.
Yes. I think, I hope I absolutely agree. And I think there's something too about, I don't know, maybe I feel this sometimes in California as well, that, we don't have problems when it comes to race. We're not a Southern, we're not a part of the South, right? It's almost racial problems are only a Southern thing, right? And I think people have moved away from that, which I'm glad, but there's still a little bit of an undercurrent there of where the real racial problems are in the South. Like, we don't really have them here, not serious ones, right? Which is, again, like, hopefully my book will help to dispel that and to help kind of show that there are certain things that, I think all cities, certainly in this country, share. But I will say one thing, though, and I meant to say this earlier about history, is that one thing that I'm, concerned about as someone who is a historian and I teach history at public university is this attack on history, and on particular kinds of history.
Yes.
Which I never thought I would see this, it sounds naive, but I just didn't think that I would see some of this kind of suppression of certain kinds of topics and certain sort of disciplines and certain, fields of thought. It's really disconcerting to me to see this happening. And I feel like in some ways I teach in California, so I don't feel like I'm ever under threat of this. And yet I have colleagues teaching in states where certain topics are not allowed anymore in the public school system. And that to me is also really scary, but it also speaks to, I think, the power of, history, particularly like critical history. And yet it's also scary because it's kind of under attack right now.
Yes, and I'm glad you've mentioned that, because that really is very much a part of our day-to-day life across the country, not necessarily here in Seattle specifically. But that doesn't mean we should say, oh, well, it would never happen here, because,
Right.
We just always need to be on guard and certainly realize that a book such as this, Seattle from the Margins, could be something that in some areas people would say, oh, no, we can't possibly have that book published.
Yeah, I know. I never thought that I would see this. And so to me, it just, I don't know, it somehow strengthens my resolve going forward to continue to just write the history that I think needs to be told.
Right.
And that comes from my own perspective, which is someone who is Japanese American and someone whose family was victimized by the government, who was forced to leave Seattle, was incarcerated without a trial. Everything was taken, so I come from that perspective. And I'll never stop kind of telling history from that perspective. So in some ways, it strengthens my resolve to continue and to understand that it's ruffling feathers. It might be ruffling feathers, and yet I think that just speaks to how important this history is, and to really just stand with my colleagues, both at the university level and also K through 12, teachers who are teaching within states right now and they're facing a lot of suppression of what they can teach and a lot of demonization of teachers in public education, which is disturbing to me. I teach at a public university, and there's so much value in that. And so I think it helps clarify, for me, the stakes of critical history.
And you write so beautifully and are so inquisitive about this that it's important that you use that motivation and your talent to bring that across and to keep at it, because that's what the world needs.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you said that the book was well written, because I really tried. I come from academia, and in academia we're taught that, it's a long process. We go through graduate school and training, and I have a background though in public history, and I always felt like I wanted to write history that was more accessible to the public and that wasn't just going to be read within academia, which is often what we're taught in grad schools. Like, well, this is going to be an academic book and you have to use academic language. And, and I always just felt like that wasn't me. And so I worked really hard to, I think, write a book that I think is, is complex in terms of some of the themes and topics that I address. And yet I really wanted it to be not just an academic book. I wanted it to be accessible to people. And so I'm so glad that you said that, because I think it was one of the things that I was really trying to do, was to take things that sometimes are only talked about in academia among a small group of people and really make it more accessible, because that's also my background as a public historian. I worked at Densho for years, and that's really what we did, is making the history accessible to broader audiences. And so I'm hopeful that the book does that as well.
I believe that it does, and we owe it to ourselves really to become this informed. It's an important history to recognize because we live here. It's part of us. And the book is available now. You can get it at all your favorite bookstores. The library, too, is very dedicated to it. It has a lot of copies of it if you want to test it out first and then go get your own copy. So that's a great thing, right, Megan? And if people want to get more insight and connect with you, they can find you on your website, true?
Yes, my website, meganasakaphd.com. So my website has a contact info page where they can write a message and it'll come to me directly. I wanted to say, too, I'm also doing a talk in Seattle, December 3rd, at the Seattle Public Library, the Central Branch. So I'll be speaking about the book then, and it'll be also a conversation with a local Seattle Times journalist.
Perfect. That is wonderful. And I'm appreciative of the fact that you've written this book, Megan, Seattle from the Margins, and thank you so greatly for taking time with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that brings us to the end of a very full hour of Inspirational Women with Megan Asaka and Sunday Morning Magazine with Jared Munzer. I'm Kate Daniels, your host, and I greatly appreciate your sharing this hour with me and these special guests. For details you might have missed or information you would like to know, please just send me an email, kated@warm1069.com, and I will get right back to you. Also, if you'd like to listen again or to share these important stories with your family and friends, find the podcast on our Warm 1069 webpage. Just click on the podcast tab, then either of the show names, and then look for the guest names. I now wish you and your family a day of savoring our time together, appreciating the gifts of the lives of all those who have come before us to give us the life we have. Have a week of the same, and then please plan to join me again next weekend for another hour of Sunday Morning Magazine and Inspirational Women on Warm 1069. Good morning.